There was a time when distance in relationships had a clear cause. People drifted apart because life pulled them in different directions. Different cities, different ambitions, different priorities. Distance had an explanation. But something strange is happening in modern relationships. Couples are not separated by miles anymore. They live together. They text constantly. They share photos. They sleep in the same bed. And yet, many people quietly feel a growing emotional distance they cannot explain. Not anger, not hatred, just a subtle feeling that something important between them has slowly faded. They still love each other. They still care. But something about the connection feels thinner than it once did. And the most confusing part is this. No one can point to the exact moment when it started. There was no dramatic fight, no betrayal, no sudden ending. Just a slow emotional drifting that happened almost invisibly. Tonight we are going to explore something most couples experience but rarely talk about openly. Why modern relationships are becoming emotionally distant, even when love is still present. And the answer is deeper than most people expect. Because the distance we feel today is not caused by a lack of love. It is caused by something far more subtle, a quiet psychological shift in how humans connect with each other. Modern couples communicate more than any generation before them. Messages throughout the day, photos shared instantly, voice notes, video calls. At first glance, it looks like connection has never been stronger. But something important is being misunderstood. Communication is not the same as connection. And the modern world has created a strange paradox. People talk more, but understand each other less. The reason is simple. Most modern communication happens in fragments. Short messages, quick reactions, small updates about daily events. Did you eat? I'm busy. Talk later. These messages maintain contact, but they do not build emotional depth. Real connection requires something that modern life rarely provides anymore. Undivided psychological attention. It requires time where two people are not distracted, not scrolling, not multitasking, not thinking about 10 other responsibilities, just listening, just observing, just being mentally present with another human being. But modern life has slowly removed these moments. And without those moments, emotional intimacy begins to thin out. Not suddenly, gradually, like color slowly fading from an old photograph. In previous generations, relationships had fewer external interruptions. Evenings were quieter. Social circles were smaller. Daily life moved slower. This meant couples naturally spent more time in focused interaction. Talking, arguing, laughing, understanding each other's emotional rhythms. Today, the environment is completely different. Attention has become the most fragmented resource in human history. Phones vibrate constantly. Work follows people home. Social media floods the brain with endless information. And the human mind can only focus deeply on a limited number of emotional signals. When attention becomes fragmented, emotional awareness decreases. And emotional awareness is the foundation of intimacy. You cannot feel deeply connected to someone you are only half present with. Even if you love them, even if you care deeply, because connection is not built on intention. Connection is built on attention, and modern couples are running out of attention. Another reason emotional distance grows is something people rarely question: comfort. Most couples believe comfort is the ultimate goal of a relationship. No drama, no tension, no uncertainty, everything stable, everything predictable. And at first, comfort feels wonderful, creates safety. It reduces anxiety. It allows people to relax around each other. But comfort also has a hidden psychological cost, because the same stability that creates safety can slowly reduce curiosity. When two people believe they already understand each other completely, they stop exploring. They stop asking deeper questions. They stop discovering new emotional layers in the person they love. And curiosity is one of the most powerful forces that keeps relationships alive. Without curiosity, people stop learning about each other. Without learning, emotional novelty disappears. Without novelty, the brain begins to experience monotony. And monotony inside a relationship feels like emotional distance, even when love is still there. The reason modern couples struggle to understand this distance is because it does not look like a problem. From the outside, everything appears normal. The relationship functions. Responsibilities are shared. Daily routines continue. But internally, something feels quieter. Conversations become more practical and less exploratory. Topics revolve around logistics instead of emotions. Did you finish that? Are you free tomorrow? Don't forget this. These conversations maintain the structure of a relationship, but they do not nourish emotional intimacy. And over time, both partners begin sensing the same quiet shift. Something that once felt vivid now feels slightly muted. But because nothing dramatic happened, neither person knows how to address it. So the distance remains unspoken, growing slowly beneath the surface of everyday life. At this point, the relationship still looks healthy, but something deeper has started to change. Attention has weakened. Curiosity has slowed. Emotional presence has thinned. And these subtle changes begin creating a quiet emotional gap between two people who still care about each other. The real question now becomes, what happens inside the human mind when that emotional gap continues growing? Because the brain does not tolerate emotional distance for long. It starts searching for something that feels alive again. And that search is where modern relationships become even more complicated. And this is where the quiet distance between couples begins revealing its deeper psychology. Because emotional distance rarely begins with conflict. It begins with familiarity. Familiarity is comforting. But familiarity also carries an invisible risk. The human brain is designed to respond strongly to novelty. New experiences trigger curiosity. Curiosity triggers attention. And attention creates emotional energy. This is why the early stages of relationships feel so alive. Everything about the other person feels new. Their stories, their reactions, their way of thinking. Every conversation feels like discovery. But over time, the brain slowly adapts. Psychologists call this process habituation. Habituation means the mind gradually becomes less responsive to things it encounters repeatedly. Even if those things once felt exciting, this adaptation is natural. It helps humans focus on new information rather than constantly reacting to familiar stimuli. But inside relationships, this process creates an unexpected effect. The person who once felt endlessly fascinating slowly begins to feel predictable. Not less valuable, not less loved, just less surprising. And surprise is one of the psychological ingredients that keeps emotional attention alive. When surprise disappears, attention weakens. And when attention weakens, connection begins to fade quietly. Many couples eventually enter something psychologists informally call the roommate phase. Not because the love has disappeared, but because the emotional dynamic has shifted. In the roommate phase, life becomes organized around shared responsibilities. Schedules, bills, daily routines, household management. These tasks are necessary for building a stable life together, but they also shift the focus of the relationship. The relationship becomes functional, efficient, practical, and slowly emotional exploration gets replaced by logistical coordination. Conversations become shorter, topics become repetitive, moments of emotional curiosity become rare, and the relationship begins to feel less like an unfolding story and more like a well-managed system. Systems work efficiently, but they rarely feel emotionally alive. Another psychological force quietly affecting modern couples is the loss of mystery. Mystery once played a larger role in relationships than people realize. When two people did not have constant access to each other's thoughts, locations, and daily experiences, curiosity remained active. You wondered what your partner was thinking. You imagined what their day looked like. You anticipated conversations. But today, technology has removed much of that mystery. Partners know where each other are, what they're doing, who they're talking to, what they're watching. Information is constant. And when information becomes constant, imagination becomes unnecessary. Without imagination, anticipation weakens. Without anticipation, emotional excitement fades. And when excitement fades, relationships start feeling quieter. Again, not broken, just less vibrant. One of the most delicate psychological shifts in long-term relationships is the gradual feeling of being taken for granted. This rarely happens intentionally. Most partners do not consciously decide to stop appreciating each other. But human attention naturally gravitates toward what feels uncertain. When something feels guaranteed, the mind relaxes its focus. Think about how carefully people behave at the beginning of a relationship. They listen more closely. They express appreciation more frequently. They notice small details. But when the relationship becomes secure, the brain assumes the bond is stable. And once stability feels guaranteed, effort quietly decreases. Not because love decreased, but because urgency disappeared. And yet, emotional intimacy requires ongoing emotional investment. When appreciation becomes less visible, people begin feeling less recognized. And when recognition fades, emotional distance begins growing silently. Perhaps the most fascinating part of this process is how invisible it can be. Both partners may feel the distance, but neither can clearly explain it, because nothing obviously negative is happening. There are no explosive arguments, no dramatic betrayals, no obvious crisis, just a subtle emotional thinning, like a conversation that slowly grows quieter without anyone deciding to stop speaking. And because the relationship still functions, many couples assume everything is fine, until one day they realize something important has quietly changed. The relationship still exists, but the emotional intensity that once defined it feels distant. When emotional intensity decreases for long periods of time, the brain begins searching for stimulation. This does not necessarily mean searching for a new partner. More often, it means searching for emotional experiences that feel vivid again. People might become more invested in work, more absorbed in hobbies, more connected with friends, more engaged with online interactions, because these environments provide something the relationship may no longer offer frequently: novel emotional feedback. The brain responds strongly to environments where attention feels fresh and responsive, where curiosity still exists, where emotional signals feel alive. And when people experience that aliveness outside the relationship, they begin noticing the contrast. This contrast is what makes emotional distance inside the relationship more visible. Once emotional distance becomes noticeable, people often respond in a subtle way. They begin protecting themselves emotionally. They share slightly less. They expect slightly less. They become slightly more independent internally, not because they want distance, but because emotional expectations that go unmet create disappointment, and the mind naturally tries to avoid repeated disappointment. So emotional openness slowly decreases, which unfortunately makes the distance even greater. Because emotional closeness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires the willingness to risk emotional response. When both partners quietly reduce vulnerability, the relationship becomes calmer, but also emotionally quieter. By now, the relationship has entered a delicate stage. Love may still exist. Respect may still exist, but emotional energy has decreased. Curiosity has slowed, and both partners may be feeling the same quiet distance without fully understanding why. The next layer reveals something even deeper, because the distance modern couples feel today is not only caused by personal habits. It is also shaped by powerful cultural and psychological forces that are changing the way humans experience intimacy itself. And this is where the question becomes even deeper, because the emotional distance many couples feel today is not only about individual relationships. It is about the environment modern relationships exist within. Human psychology evolved in a world that was dramatically simpler than the one we live in today. For most of human history, people experienced a limited number of emotional connections. Communities were small. Daily life moved slowly. Relationships existed inside stable social circles. But modern life has expanded the emotional landscape in ways the human mind is still learning to navigate. Today, every person is exposed to thousands of emotional signals every day. Images of other couples, stories of other relationships, advice about what love should feel like. constant comparisons between one's own relationship and countless others displayed online. This environment subtly reshapes how people experience intimacy, because comparison quietly influences perception, even when people know those comparisons are unrealistic. One of the most powerful forces shaping modern relationships is the silent expectation that love should always feel emotionally intense. Movies portray passion as constant. Social media highlights only the happiest moments. Relationship advice often focuses on excitement and fulfillment, but real relationships move through emotional seasons. There are periods of deep closeness, and there are periods of calm stability. In earlier generations, this rhythm was accepted as natural. But today, calm stability is often misinterpreted as emotional distance. And when people begin believing something is wrong simply because excitement has faded, they start searching for explanations. They analyze their partner's behavior more critically. They question their own feelings more intensely. And this analysis sometimes creates emotional tension that did not previously exist. The mind becomes focused on what feels missing rather than what remains strong. And the more people focus on what feels missing, the more emotionally distant the relationship begins to feel. Another profound psychological shift in modern relationships is the way constant stimulation affects emotional bonding. The human brain releases dopamine when it encounters new experiences. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter associated with anticipation and excitement. In the past, relationships were one of the most significant sources of emotional novelty. But today, novelty is everywhere. Endless entertainment, endless information, endless digital interactions. The brain is constantly receiving small bursts of stimulation from outside the relationship. And this continuous stimulation subtly changes the brain's emotional expectations. When the brain becomes accustomed to frequent novelty, stable relationships can begin feeling less stimulating by comparison. Not because the relationship lacks value, but because the brain has been trained to expect constant emotional variation. And stable intimacy often operates at a slower, calmer rhythm. This contrast between the fast pace of modern stimulation and the slower pace of emotional bonding creates a psychological mismatch. A mismatch that many couples experience without realizing it. Modern culture has also changed the way people approach vulnerability. On one hand, people talk more openly about emotions than previous generations. But on the other hand, many people also feel a deeper fear of emotional exposure. Because modern relationships exist within an environment where alternatives always appear visible. Dating apps, social networks, constant reminders that other options exist. This environment subtly changes how safe people feel investing deeply in one connection. Even inside committed relationships, part of the mind remains aware of the possibility of loss or replacement. And when the mind senses that relationships can be fragile, it sometimes responds by protecting itself emotionally. People reveal slightly less. They depend slightly less. They maintain small emotional boundaries to protect themselves from potential disappointment. But emotional intimacy requires openness. It requires allowing another person to see parts of you that are uncertain, vulnerable, evolving. When vulnerability decreases, emotional depth decreases as well. And once again, distance quietly grows. One of the most surprising truths about emotional distance in modern relationships is that it often happens to both partners at the same time. Both individuals may feel the same subtle disconnection. Both may miss the emotional intensity the relationship once had. But each person assumes the other is comfortable with the current state of the relationship. So neither speaks first. Silence becomes normal. Routine continues. And the distance slowly becomes part of everyday life. Not because love disappeared, but because awareness never surfaced. Yet despite everything we have explored, there is an important truth that should not be overlooked. Emotional distance does not always mean emotional loss. Often it simply means that connection has become unconscious. Relationships, like living systems, require attention to remain vibrant. Curiosity must be renewed. Conversations must deepen again. Moments of presence must be recreated intentionally. When two people choose to look at each other again with curiosity rather than assumption, emotional energy can return. Because the human mind is always evolving. And the person you think you fully understand today is not exactly the same person they were a year ago. People change. They grow. They develop new fears, new hopes, new perspectives. But rediscovering those changes requires attention. And attention requires intention. Perhaps the real question is not simply why couples today feel more distant than ever. Perhaps the deeper question is this: when did we stop paying close attention to the person we love? Distance does not always begin with conflict. Sometimes it begins with familiarity that slowly replaced curiosity, with routines that replaced exploration, with distractions that replaced presence. Modern relationships face challenges previous generations never encountered. But they also possess something powerful: awareness. And awareness creates choice. The choice to listen again. The choice to ask deeper questions again. The choice to rediscover the person who has been quietly evolving beside you. Because emotional closeness is not a permanent state. It is something that must be renewed again and again. And sometimes, simply recognizing the quiet distance is the first step toward rebuilding the connection that once felt effortless. Take a moment to reflect on your own relationships. And if this exploration helped you understand something you have quietly felt but never fully explained, subscribe to Voxlore Audio, because some of the most important truths about human connection are the ones we rarely speak about openly.